Good evening and welcome to this, the third annual Leonard Steenberg Memorial Lecture. When I first suggested to our guest of honour tonight that he come back to Policy Exchange for address, I had a number of thoughts about possible events which he might speak at. And I outlined a number of them, and one of them was this Steenberg Memorial Lecture. And Francis had absolutely no doubt about which event it was that he wanted to speak at, having the fondest memories of Lord Steenberg of Belfast from your period as party chairman, when Leonard was a highly successful deputy treasurer of the party at a time when the Tory party's fortunes were not exactly buoyant. And it's fascinating to me to see here tonight how many people are attending who reflect the diversity of Leonard Steenberg's interests. Those who knew him from business, where he was one of the country's most successful entrepreneurs, turning a small milk shop in the back streets of Belfast into one of Britain's largest businesses, as president of Lancashire County Cricket Club, as perhaps an exponent of the big society before it became the big society, as one of Britain's most munificent charitable contributors to a great number of causes, preeminently the Manchester Jewish Federation and the Imperial War Museum North. We also welcome here today those who reflect the diversity of his political interests, not just our guest of honour tonight, but his friend Lord Trimble, former First Minister of Northern Ireland, who actually introduced me to Leonard, and Lord Bew from Belfast, also obviously from whence Leonard came. A welcome also to Graham Brady, chairman of the 1922 committee, who was Leonard's local MP and still the local MP of the Steenberg family there in Cheshire. But above all, preeminently, the welcome and the honour is due to the Steenberg family and preeminently to Lady Steenberg, who continues as patroness-in-chief of this lecture. Thank you, Beryl. Thank you to Jonathan Steenberg, his son, for all your support for this event, and to Lynn and Jimmy Attias, daughter and son-in-law. Thank you for coming tonight. Please join me in welcoming them here on this occasion. It's a great privilege to be able to welcome you back, Francis. I know there is something of a tussle of love between you and Michael Gove as to his actual founding father and founding chairman, and it's one which we're flattered to have. But you're always welcome back here on this platform. I think you're known personally, or in name at least, to everyone here in this room, but the issue of the relationship between ministers and civil servants is one which you have played a critical part in mainstreaming in the national debate, from something that was of interest previously, principally to specialists, to something that's much more part of the public discourse. And that credit is down to you, and the success that you've had in that is reflected also in the fact that there is a huge interest across the party divide, as personified by the Right Honourable Margaret Hodge, MP, Chairman of the Public Accounts Committee, who's here tonight, whom we're very much looking forward to delivering the vote of thanks here. So, Francis, we look forward to hearing what you had to say. This room didn't exist when you were our chairman. We were a tiny refugee centre next door where everything had to be moved around when there was any speaker coming to visit. We're delighted to be able to welcome you here in these circumstances tonight, and always look forward to hearing what you have to say. Thank you.
Well, Dean, thank you very much indeed. I'm trying to remember how long ago it was we set up a Policy Exchange, 2002, I think. So 11th year. It was indeed a shared office next door. It was a kind of cottage industry. It's now turned into a sort of multinational business with a huge scale. I'm really happy to share the honour of having founded Policy Exchange with Michael. I mean, when I invited him to become the first chairman of it, it felt like there was very much a shared endeavour. And also with Nicholas Bowles, who really was the entrepreneur, because actually what we did was Archie Norman and I picked Nicholas to set it up, and he was the one who kind of made it all happen. I mean, I just took the credit. Really gone on taking the credit ever since, but I am a politician. It's such a pleasure to be delivering this lecture this evening in memory of Leonard. It's pleasure tinged, obviously, with sadness that it's in his memory rather than in his very vigorous, larger-than-life presence. I well remember my dinner with Leonard when he agreed to give generous support to policy exchange. Dinner, you will understand, at Crockford's. It was just dinner. And he agreed to give generous support to policy when it was really a startup. It was kind of a cottage industry. And he was really prominent among those who decided to back it before it was fashionable, before it was all over the media, and took it to the scale and influence that it now boasts. I'm so grateful to Leonard and all of those who see the intellectual vigour of the centre-right having been revived should be proud of what Leonard helped to create here. It's very special. My topic tonight is the civil service, one of the great British institutions, and civil service reform, which is one of our great traditions. More than 150 years ago, the Northcote Trevelyan report stated boldly that admission into the civil service is indeed eagerly sought after, but it is for the unambitious and the indolent or incapable that it is chiefly desired. That has changed. Northcote Trevelyan ultimately led to the end of the patronage system and to the introduction of a permanent, politically neutral civil service with open, competitive recruitment based on the ability to do the job. But it was 15 years after the report was written before it was actually implemented. After the First World War, the Haldane changes put in place the basic structure of separate departments and accounting officers that has been essentially unaltered since. The civil service changed dramatically during the Second World War to meet those extraordinary challenges. Outsiders from business, from industry and academia were imported in huge numbers. It was a highly organised and successful process. And when the Attlee government took office after the war with a radical reforming programme, there were real concerns whether the civil service, without those imports, was capable of implementing a radical programme. A Labour MP at the time suggested a parliamentary select committee to examine whether changes to the service's capability were needed. He particularly wished to pursue scientific methods of business organisation. Well, that suggestion was effortlessly seen off. The head of the civil service, Sir Edward Bridges, in a letter to his fellow permanent secretaries, said, and I quote, "Such a committee could not get down to business without an immense amount of inquiry into government departments and evidence from highly placed civil servants, and I expect that we shall all feel that we have no time to spare for this. Moreover, even if we were convinced that an inquiry was necessary, I imagine we should feel that a select committee was not the right kind of body to carry out the inquiry." In 1968, the Fulton Commission sat, as royal commissions do, took minutes and lasted for years. It made numerous recommendations, but I challenge anyone to remember any significant change that resulted from it. In 2004, Tony Blair set out plans for a civil service with professional and specialist skills, a civil service open to the public, a more strategic and innovative approach to policy. The world had changed, he said, and the civil service must change with it. That was nearly 10 years ago, but today the diagnosis remains pretty similar. When I was sent Tony Blair's 2004 speech, some months after we had published our own reform plan, I was struck by the sense of déjà vu. I found I'd been echoing his concerns, indeed, in some cases, his very phrases. And the one specific change that he announced, that senior officials would in future be appointed on fixed tenures, mysteriously never actually made it into action. In short, civil service reform plans have generally tended to end up gathering dust on the library shelves. We need to make sure that this doesn't turn out to be Groundhog Day. Britain is in a global race, and to compete, we need a world-class 21st century civil service capable of delivering a more balanced economy, a fairer society, and the best public services. And today's support for reform is universal. It runs right across the political spectrum. It's supported by numerous think tanks, including the Institute for Government, the IPPR, Reform, Policy Exchange itself, and many others. Critically, and I think this is a first, civil servants themselves want reform. And most importantly, the public deserve the best public services, and taxpayers deserve best value for money. Today, therefore, it can't be a question of whether we reform. It simply has to happen. Over the years, when governments have embarked on reform of the civil service, it really hasn't made all that much difference whether the reform plans are controversial. Frankly, they rarely have been controversial, and ours is no exception. Bob Kerslake and I, the head of the civil service, and I published the civil service reform plan last summer, nearly a year ago. It set out a series of specific, practical actions to address long-standing weaknesses. Each was individually quite modest, yet taken together, if fully implemented, they would undoubtedly lead to transformative change. What would the end product be? It would be a civil service which is smaller, flatter, faster, focused on outcome, not process, more digital, more unified, more accountable for delivery, more capable, with modern terms and conditions, better managed, with better performance management, and finally, and this is really important, more fun to work for, more satisfying to work for. And no one seriously argued since then that any material part of the plan is either wrong or unnecessary, with the possible exception of some trade unions opposing some of the reforms to archaic terms and conditions. There's broad agreement between the major political parties, all three of which uniquely have either current or recent experience of government. And it's especially commendable that the Labour Party have taken an approach in general to eschew formulaic opposition to civil service reform. The bulk of the criticisms from outside commentators have not been that we're trying to do too much or do the wrong things, but that if anything, we're not going far enough. Most of all, as I say, civil servants themselves are impatient for change. I recently spoke at a gathering of newly entered members of the senior civil service. They were absolutely terrific. They were bright, able, energetic, ambitious to change the world. But to a man and woman, they were frustrated. They were frustrated by a culture that seems to weigh them down, a culture that is overly bureaucratic, that is risk-averse, hierarchical, that's focused on process, not on outcomes, that all of that somehow makes the whole less than the sum of the parts. So this plan draws on the frustrations of civil servants as much as those of ministers and the public. And many of the most substantive ideas in our plan have come out of work led by permanent secretaries themselves. So the public wants change, ministers want change, civil servants want change. Why then isn't it happening as fast as we like? Nearly 1 year on from publication of the reform plan, the record of successful implementation is mixed. I'll be updating Parliament with a detailed 1 year on report in just a few weeks' time. But I don't think anyone's going to be that surprised to hear that while we've definitely made some progress, too little of what we set out nearly 12 months ago has been fully executed. It isn't that nothing's been changed, far from it. A lot of hard work has happened, and we can see some real progress. Today, more public services are being delivered digitally, and we'll see many more switched online. We estimate that by shifting transactional services offered by central government departments from offline to digital channels, we can make £1.2 billion of potential savings between now and 2015, and up to £1.7 billion a year beyond 2015. Sharing services is going to become the norm for all departments, starting with HR, procurement, and payroll. We're making progress already with some policy areas, legal, services, and internal audit. It is now 9 years now, since Sir Peter Gershon first proposed that Whitehall should move to shared services in 2004. And frankly, in the last 8 months, we've made significantly more progress than in the whole of the 8 years before then. Changes to terms and conditions have begun to be introduced, albeit gradually, to remove the archaic outlying conditions that were simply an embarrassment to civil servants when they were picked up and lampooned by the press. A 5-year capabilities plan for the civil service to rectify serious capability gaps was published in April, albeit 6 months later than we'd said. The civil service talent strategy, absent for far too long, will be launched this year to identify and track talent from apprentices right through to permanent secretaries. But again, this is behind schedule. We've promulgated a civil service-wide competency framework. It's a tough and edgy document. It's very good, which, if used rigorously in every appraisal, every recruitment, and every promotion assessment, will really introduce some culture change and drive up standards. And that's the point, really. It's one thing to publish the document. The difficult part is to implement the action, and that's what needs to change. The fact remains that too many things that should have been done haven't been done. Other projects have been delayed or are only just getting underway. Ask any civil servant, has the civil service really reformed in the last year? I doubt many would say they've seen that much evidence of that. Why? Well, one issue was that it took far too long to get in place a serious team working on civil service reform. We've got that now, I'm happy to say, some of them here in the room, and they're stars. But that's actually a symptom of one of the problems with the civil service. It often takes far too long to get in place the right people with the right skills quickly. Another part of the reason is classic catch-22. The things that need reform are exactly the things that make reform difficult. The capability gap, the excessive bureaucracy, the lack of responsiveness to government priorities, poor accountability, policy being designed without reference to its implementation. And there's not much argument about that diagnosis either. It comes out consistently from the civil service people surveys, which are done annually. These are concerns that are felt by civil servants as much as, actually more than in many cases, others who come into contact with the service. They're ingrained cultural problems, and they're really hard to root out. Of course, there are plenty of departments that will point to the transformative work they're doing on the government's radical programme of economic and public service reform. Take the Department for Education, for example, delivering a radical change with a real impact on children and young people. And yet by 2015, it will have halved its administrative budget and halved its headcount. Or the Ministry of Justice's new rehabilitation programme, radical, challenging, innovative, driven by a minister with a mission and being executed by professional and effective civil servants. Other departments have seen significant reductions in headcount and a corresponding rise in productivity. And there was much to do. Over the past few years, while productivity in the private services sector, the best analogue to the public services, productivity had risen by 30%, around 30%. In contrast, between 1997 and 2010, as the ONS have recently confirmed, public sector productivity was flat. If productivity in the public sector had risen by a comparable amount to the private services sector, Britain's economic and fiscal position would have been radically different. The structural deficit would have been half what the coalition government inherited. Today, the civil service is smaller than at any time since the Second World War, 15% smaller since 2010, and departments have already committed publicly to further reductions. Most departments have cut their central overheads by 30% and some by much more. There are no hiding places anymore, and that means to deliver services of the quality that the public are entitled to expect, and those expectations are rising. We need to do things better. So what's the answer to this? Is it to launch a massive, once in every 2 generations study of the civil service and everything around it, potentially putting everything on hold when there are immediate demands for the civil service to function better? It's argued that there's been no such study since Fulton, nearly 50 years ago. But what did Fulton actually change? Nothing really fundamental. There was some actually very sensible stuff about being professionalising, but actually we still hear every iteration of civil service reform has the same phrase: the age of the generalist has gone. Hasn't gone, and nor should it actually. But we feel we have to say the same thing again and again. So nothing fundamental really changed as a result of Fulton. And then you've got to ask, do we want fundamental change? Do we want to uproot the whole Northcote-Trevelyan model that's lasted for 150 years, a permanent, politically impartial civil service where appointments are made on merit? I'm not persuaded. Most of us really value the best of what the civil service in its current form does when it's given the opportunity. Since I came back into government after an 18-year gap, I've often been asked if the longest sabbatical in political history, I've often been asked if the civil service is as good as it was. My answer: the best are absolutely as good as they've ever been. The specialist functions, finance, HR, commercial, which used to be done by generalists on a sort of Buggins turn, your turn to do that, 2 years doing finance, and see how it goes. Those services are better. Those functions are much better, much more professional. If there's a criticism today, I would say it's that the civil service today less easily accommodates the quirky and the maverick, the original lateral thinker who innovates and provides challenge. The problem is that really good people, as I found with those excellent new entrants to the senior civil service, they feel weighed down by a system that inhibits them from giving their best. And that's why the civil service ends up as less, a phrase I've stolen shamelessly from Lord Hennessy, whose many magisterial studies of Whitehall are required reading. It's less than the sum of its parts, brilliant though so many of the parts are. Doesn't mean, of course, there aren't great examples of great work. My own efficiency and reform group in the Cabinet Office, with a board chaired jointly by myself and the Chief Secretary to the Treasury, set up in the first days of the coalition government, pulling together under one roof all cross-government operational functions: procurement, ICT, communications, property. It's transformed the way government works, acting as an effective operations centre at the heart of government, driving efficiency and clamping down on waste. It's a complete turnaround from the way government worked before. And we have some amazing civil servants. Some have been brought in from the private sector, but many more who aren't, who are long-term civil servants. They delivered £3.75 billion worth of savings in our first year of government, first 10 months actually, £5.5 billion in the second. And yesterday I was able to announce we'd beaten our own target, saved another, in proper folding money savings, there aren't smoke and mirrors and sleight of hand, another £10 billion of savings in the last financial year ending in March. They've made these savings hand in hand with their colleagues across Whitehall, in the Treasury and elsewhere, to transform working practices and drive reform. Transparency team, another great example. Governments have been hoarding their data for decades. We've overturned that, become a world leader in releasing open data. New government digital service, built gov.uk, a new online home for government services and information. It's faster, easier to use, designed around what users need to get done, not around, which used to be the case, the ways government want them to do it. It's saving tens of millions of pounds a year. And I'm quite proud of this on their behalf. It won the overall category in the recent Design Museum's Design of the Year award, beating the Shard and Eat Your Heart Out Thomas Heatherwick, the Olympic torch. So I don't find that civil servants oppose change. What I find is that when we talk about reform, people get energized, they get on board, they grasp the opportunity. So I'm loath to believe that fundamental change is needed, that the system is incapable of adapting and evolving into what modern Britain needs. All this convinces me that if that we can, through incremental change, create a transformed, modern 21st century service able to sustain Britain in the global race. So what else needs to change? Well, too often in the civil service, and again, a common complaint of civil servants themselves, there's a bias to inertia. There's little incentive to try new things. Any change is endlessly scrutinized and analyzed for risk and benefit, while there's little downside to presiding over an inefficient status quo. Too often people feel if I try and change it and it goes wrong, it can wreck my career. This bias to inertia and bias against innovation is hugely frustrating for those who do want change. They can become massively disillusioned. We need to learn from Silicon Valley and from the high-tech companies I visited in Israel last week. Their mantra is constantly to try new things, even if some fail. But if you do fail, fail fast and make sure the organization learns from it. All the best organizations know that you learn more from the things which are tried that don't work than you do from things which are tried and do work. Because if you're never trying anything that doesn't work, you're never innovating. There have been occasions, happily rare, when ministers both in the current and previous governments have found that decisions they've made don't get implemented. For example, a cabinet committee decided some months ago that all common goods and services should be bought in aggregate so that we can leverage the scale of government as a customer to reduce cost and price. Some parts of Whitehall simply thought they could ignore that decision. Not acceptable, as the leaders of the civil service immediately agreed. And when ministers complain about the failure to implement decisions, they're sometimes caricatured as disliking challenge, wanting nothing but yes men and women around them. Of course, the precise reverse is the case. Good ministers want bright, knowledgeable officials who will give the most brutally candid advice, who will, in that slightly hackneyed phrase, speak truth unto power. No sane minister wants to hear about the effects of a decision after the decision has been made and implemented. You want to have the best evidence, the best advice, the best information before you decide. You want to have a serious, crunchy, private discussion with plenty of encouragement of and opportunity for open challenge and debate. It's sometimes said that the civil service is risk-averse because ministers are risk-averse. Far from it, actually. Ministers belong to one of the most risky occupations there is. We have no tenure. We are exposed daily to public scrutiny of the most uninhibited kind. What ministers are, however, is surprise-averse. Any government that embarks on radical, transformative reform needs to understand the risks and be prepared for them. What that means is civil servants have to be honest, have to speak their mind, set out credible reasons for not doing or doing differently something if they don't think it'll work in the way the minister has proposed. And we should never tamper with that. Indeed, we should reinforce it. Too often, ministers aren't told everything, or they're told things which turn out not to be right. So we should be meticulous about the evidence and the data on which we base decisions, and our default setting should be that we publish the evidence and the data, while obviously vigorously protecting the safe private space for policy advice and policy discussion. But once a decision's been made, it has to be implemented swiftly and fully. It really is as simple as that. Sometimes a permanent secretary may conclude that what a minister wants to do isn't consistent with value for taxpayers' money, in which case there's a solemn obligation to ask the minister to issue a written direction. And that's fine. Any minister should be confident enough in the judgment that he or she has made to be willing to justify it in public. So, speaking truth unto power, that's the proper deal. So what next? How can we empower the best to shine, recognise the people who are delivering for the country, and remove that bias to inertia? Well, implementing our civil service reform plan actions, that's necessary. It's not sufficient, but it's necessary. What next after that? First, the overall operating model. Is the model where each department is a freestanding entity with all of its services separately provided, is that still sustainable? Or do we need a unified operating system, one set of high standards? We know from the research among civil servants that they themselves want a more unified system. They see themselves as working for the Crown rather than just their own individual department. And that's not just about sharing services, but about embracing a more corporate approach to talent management, to capacity building, and to the leadership of expert services. Secondly, accountability. As I said, nearly 10 years ago, Tony Blair announced that the government would radically extend one of the central principles of Northcote Trevelyan, that of appointment by merit, by applying it to existing posts as well as new ones. And that would mean establishing a new norm that all senior civil service jobs would be 4-year placements with no presumption of permanence in post. So why didn't that happen? Why do we still have the same hierarchical system where senior people are seen to have a job for life regardless of their performance? We need a civil service where promotion is faster and rewards delivering results on the ground. There's also the question of who appoints permanent secretaries. We said in our civil service reform plan that we wanted to strengthen the role of ministers in the appointment of permanent secretaries. There have been modest changes in that direction by the Civil Service Commission. We want to go further, so the selection panel would submit to the Secretary of State a choice of candidates and leave the final choice to the Secretary of State. It's interesting to see that the Institute for Government is endorsing that very suggestion. And finally, there's the question of how well supported ministers are. Actually, in this country, ministers are less well supported than in any comparable country. Obviously, there's one extreme, America, which gives the administration enormous personal support and power to make huge numbers of personal appointments made by the administration. Closer to home in France, allows its ministers wide powers of appointment, creating a cabinet, a personal cabinet, quite substantial for ministers. Even when we look at Westminster-style systems like Canada, Australia, we see that ministers there have far more direct support. And this matters when ministers have only small teams chasing progress and pulling the levers on policy. Many Labour former ministers who've spoken out on civil service reform have called for greater direct support for ministers. And that's not about more political advisors. It could be about being able to bring in from outside into ministers' offices people of experience and ability. These may be found beyond Whitehall, but actually they can just as easily be career civil servants. What they must be, however, is personally responsible to and chosen by the minister. That's the key to sharpening accountability. So, Northcote Trevelyan's model for the civil service has lasted 150 years, and it's the model I'd like to keep. But we do need to make it work better. Civil Service Code, now the statute, the law, sets out the core values of the civil service: impartiality, honesty, objectivity, integrity. Well, no one's going to argue with any of those. They're good values. They're really important. But equally, they're static, passive values. You could imagine someone sitting alone in a room for a year, doing nothing, and not offend against any of those values. Kind of not enough. And two of them are essentially mirrors of the other two. Gus O'Donnell, when he was head of the civil service, coined 4 Ps: pace, professionalism, passion, and pride. And those are great virtues. They're warm, they're dynamic, they're about getting things done and done really well. They're human values. And it's time we created the modern 21st century civil service that we need. A service that retains its impartiality and its ability to serve a government of any hue, but that champions above all excellence. Excellence in the policy advice it gives to ministers, and excellence, and this is equally important, in its ability to implement the agenda of the government of the day. The path to excellence starts, but it certainly doesn't end with the civil service reform plan that we published last year. It includes some necessary first steps, but they're certainly not enough. To achieve real excellence and to stay ahead of the game An organisation of the size and complexity of the civil service has constantly to evolve and to keep striving to improve itself. It may not today be where it needs to be, but we can get there. We have the opportunity to set new standards, raise the game, and become a world-class organisation that other countries aspire to emulate. And that's the opportunity that Britain has to grasp. Thank you.
I guess one was very kindly agreed to answer questions, so if I can throw it open to the floor. No question too outrageous. The only house rule is you have to state your name and organisation first. Do I see any questions?
Do I get a glass of wine first?
Hello, Francis. I'm Bernard Jenkins,
Yes,
the
tell us who you are, Bernard.
Chairman of the Public Administration Select Committee, and I commend you for your incredible devotion to the civil service as an institution, which I don't think we've seen paralleled in any ministerial appointment for a great many years. And unlike your civil service reform plan, everybody knows about it. We did interview privately one cabinet minister from the previous government who said she'd been running her department for 2 years before she realised there was a civil service reform plan endorsed by the Prime Minister, Mr. Blair. But can I perhaps also thank you for paying the Public Administration Select Committee the compliment for entering the debate about what may or may not be our final and most important proposal in our inquiry into the future of the civil service, that there should perhaps be some kind of parliamentary commission to look into the future of the civil service. But I would just suggest that there are 2 points which you're not quite engaging in general terms. One is this question as to whether the system can be fixed in the ordinary course of government, because the events like the Child Support Agency or the tax credit system or major failures of major government programmes seem to be increasing, occurring more frequently and with more serious consequences every time they occur. It's become a normal part of government that there's some bit of the machinery that's in a permanent state of crisis, like the Borders Agency. And secondly, in one breath you're saying uphold the Northcote Trevelyan system and Haldane and all that, but on the other hand, you are now talking about the possibility of moving to a unified operating system of fixed terms for permanent secretaries, more ministerial influence over the appointment of permanent secretaries, and much larger staffs personally responsible to and chosen by the minister. I'm quoting your very words. These are very big changes, or potentially very big changes. What role should Parliament have in overseeing these changes, given that the civil service is one of our great institutions, and as Conservatives we all love our institutions.
We do indeed.
And this institution is one of the pillars of our unwritten constitution, providing for that stability over 150 years, which has broadly been a success. If these changes are going to be lasting and permanent and part of a stable settlement, how should Parliament be involved in this? And isn't a parliamentary commission of some kind the right way to involve Parliament on a cross-party basis, so there is a proper consensus about the changes you want to make, not to interrupt the progress that you're involved with, but to strengthen it?
Okay, well, I mean, I think obviously if we needed to change the legislative basis, which I don't think we do actually, Parliament would need to be involved, because Parliament has to change the law. But I don't think we need to do that. That's why I say I think we can do incremental change. I don't think actually the changes I'm talking about here in a speculative way are that dramatic. It's very much kind of building on, fixed terms, fixed tenures for senior civil servants. Well, Tony Blair thought he'd announced that. I mean, he did announce it. It just didn't happen. Ministerial, larger ministerial offices. kind of coming into existence in some parts of Whitehall anyway, and Number 10's, frankly, pretty much always worked on that basis, and in recent years, under both governments, the Chancellor's office as well. So there's no kind of great drama about any of this. A new operating model, we're kind of, these things, in any complex organisation, these things come and go. You have things done more collectively, less collectively, tend in difficult times, tighter times, to do it more collectively. So there's no great drama about any of this. And in terms of parliamentary scrutiny, your committee does a very good job. I show up at regular intervals, as does Bob and Jeremy, and you interrogate us, and you, in a very penetrating way, if I may respectfully say so. And that's good, and that will continue. The question I just ask is, I mean, whether a kind of full-on commission is necessary, because actually what tends to happen, as I said, Fulton Commission took minutes and lasted years, and at the end of it, kind of what transpired, not a lot. So I think let's work with what we've got. Let's make change happen. And it's difficult for all the reasons I set out, which is why I don't think that kind of uprooting it all is the right way to go. You ask, can it change? Well, it's a good challenge, actually, but it's not. I don't think that's system-based. Actually, I don't think you look at any other civil service around the world and find that they found that magic elixir where you can build in incentives for people to do things differently, to embrace change and innovation and all the things, be less hierarchical, all these difficult things to achieve. It's kind of tough to do, and what it needs is drive and energy and leadership, and a shared sense of need, and that's why I think there's an opportunity now to do this and do it properly, because the demand for change comes so widely, as I say, from politicians across the piece. There's not party political contentious, from civil servants themselves, from the public who want to be able to interact with government in a way that's better and quicker and more convenient and more effective, that wastes less of their time as well as the time of those delivering the services. So, am I certain that this will work? No. Will it turn out to be Groundhog Day? I hope not, because actually we can't afford it. Who's next?
Hi, I'm Deep Sagar. I admire your incremental evolutionary approach, but I wondered if you saw the civil service as a monopoly. Perhaps there might be potential in bringing the positive incentives that really lie at the root of competitive markets. So one of the things that strikes me is competitive markets give power to consumers. Mm. So if you said, say, to chief executives of Quangos, once a year your consumers must vote for you to stay in office, I'm sure behavior would change if it needs to change. Similarly, if you said consumers of permanent secretaries are ministers, once a year, if they had that vote, probably behavior would change. So I would recommend really looking for those positive incentives that competitive markets have.
Interesting and tempting. I mean, I totally agree with I worship at the altar of the free market and competition. And one of the things that I think is, again, common across the piece politically is an understanding that competitive competition in the delivery of public services is a powerful agent of change. One of the things that we have done is introduce a different approach, different variant into the mix, instead of the old binary choice between, it's being done in-house or it's being completely outsourced to a sort of full-blooded, for-profit commercial entity. We're looking at more interesting models such as the mutual spin-out or the joint venture, where staff themselves choose to take themselves out of the public sector. Has the benefit in terms of growth of introducing a new entity, a new enterprise into the economy. And we've done a few of those, and there'll be more of those to come, with staff led and owned and led to a greater or lesser extent by the staff themselves. And actually, we've introduced some competition into the provision of policy as well. One of the actions in our plan was we introduced a small, on a kind of pilot basis, contestable policy fund, where we invited departments to bid to commission policy work from outside, from think tanks. The first one we commissioned ourselves from, Policy Exchange, but from IPPR. Actually, interestingly, on the civil service accountability models, that was a classic thing where you would not want that work to have been done by the civil service itself, because that would be a classic kind of monopoly situation. You want it to be done much more objectively than any organisation is likely to be able to do about itself. So yeah, I mean, in general, as a principle, I think it's good. Voting for users voting for permanent secretaries at the end of the year. Well, I'll try it on, but I don't. I think it's politicians who have to submit themselves to election rather than civil servants.
Gentleman in the third row there.
Robert Hancock. Mr. Maude, could you tell us a little bit about the civil service trade unions?
Well, I get on very well with them in varying degrees. And I see one of them represented here. Hello, Dave. And we talk regularly, and we don't all agree, and always agree. And they have a very proper role in the public sector, as they do in the economy more generally. So we have undertaken some serious reforms, which have involved discussion with the unions. Serious reform of the civil service compensation scheme, which was outrageously expensive, and it's still pretty generous, but it brought it kind of more in line with what would be the norm in the private sector, and we did that collaboratively with the civil service unions. Reform of the civil service pension scheme, and indeed the whole public sector pensions. And we worked very closely with the unions on that. And actually, it was one of those productive things where we achieved what we needed, which was a significant reduction in the cost to the taxpayer of public sector pensions. But the discussion enabled us to do it in a way that met the concerns of union members and civil servants themselves more closely. So that was kind of a good process. So we get on well. We don't always agree, but it's fine.
Lady there.
We've got to ask Dave to have a comeback on that.
Thank you. I'm Dave Penman, General Secretary of the FDA, one of the civil service unions. And as you know, Francis, we have welcomed many of the aspects of the civil service reform plan. We think there are a lot of sensible proposals in there. I just wanted to pick on one issue. I just wonder how you feel that ministers surrounding themselves with civil servants whose career and employment is more closely aligned to the patronage of that minister will deliver greater truth unto power, which was the subject of your speech.
Okay, well, that's a great... Okay, do. Thank you.
So I'm Jane Dudman. I'm from The Guardian. I edit our Public Leaders Network. And my question, actually, I've got one other question, but the question that follows on from that is that I don't quite understand the logic of how the fixed term tenure idea for permanent secretaries fits with the idea of the ministers appointing their own or choosing their own permanent secretaries. Because as you pointed out, ministers are on an unsure tenure. So supposing a minister comes in and appoints a permanent secretary, and then the permanent secretary lasts for 4 years, and the minister might be off after, well, 1 2 or something like that. So
Happily
just
longer
point
these days.
Well, happily. And of course, you've been there a long time. And my other question, just very quickly.
Certainly feels like it.
And my other question was, you mentioned the IPPR report, and I wondered when that was going to be published.
Shortly. Well, actually, we haven't committed whether we're going to. It's advice to ministers, so it's kind of in the private space. But the issue about tenure, and obviously what we've said is that if ministers were to have a choice of candidates, it's only after there's been a really rigorous process invigilated by the Civil Service Commission to make sure that the candidates from whom ministers could choose were ones who were capable of serving not just that minister but a future minister. That's the same. It's not a kind of, I pick one I like. It's you only get to choose people who are capable of being proper permanent secretaries after a rigorous selection process. I mean, I'm not suggesting anything like what Jack Straw describes when he was a cabinet minister, and he was involved in the appointment of, I think, 3 permanent secretaries, and he insisted on having, and was given, a choice of candidates in each case. In one case, he chaired the selection panel himself, which I'm sure is grossly improper, but kind of when it feels like it's the right thing to do, these things can mysteriously happen. The point about if are the people you appoint, people only tell you what you want to hear. Well, you've met my special advisors. The truth is, you're much more likely to get ask any minister, you're much more likely to get the most candid and often brutal advice from your special advisors, who have no tenure at all except at your will, actually, because they are utterly they have a sole loyalty to the minister. It isn't a conflict of loyalty at all, and they want the minister to succeed. So they will, and they do. And ask any minister, and it's the same. They'll give you pretty brutal advice, because they have got nothing to prove. Yeah.
2 more questions. Lady at the back, been waiting patiently. You, yes.
Wait for the microphone, Lizzie.
Hello, Lizzie Knoll just finished her second short stint in the civil service, and I was interested in your experience from Silicon Valley, because what my heart slightly sinks when I sit in a room of civil servants and they say it's a very flat management structure here, there's no hierarchy. So I was interested in the hierarchy point, because it seems to me that all the engineers over in Silicon Valley, all very flat and entrepreneurial, but actually what seems to be lacking in some parts of the civil service is accountability from senior people who are individually responsible, succeed or fail. And I was interested to know what the parallels were that you'd learned from the Silicon Valley experience.
Well, actually, it's very interesting. I mean, there's 2 things. One is the kind of the Google mantra, fail fast. Try something, test it, prove it. If it doesn't work, stop doing it. The only unforgivable thing is not to have tried something that doesn't work. It's not to stop doing it when you've discovered that it doesn't work, and not to make sure that the organization's learnt from the experience. That's the first thing. Second thing is, hierarchy is not about structure and organization. It's about behavior. And actually, it's a great, I recommend to everyone, a book I just read while I was on my way to Israel last week, called Startup Nation. It's about Israel, and there's a really interesting analysis of how the Israel Defense Force works, the culture there, which is about huge empowerment of often really very young soldiers who don't have a massive kind of hierarchical structure above them, but who have the 2 things. They have quite a lot of, they're trusted with quite a lot of decision-taking and required to exercise it. So that's the kind of freedom and empowerment part. The second is an acute sense of responsibility, that they can't pass that on to anyone else. And the danger with an organization that behaves in a hierarchical way is that people don't take personal responsibility for what they do. And actually, one of the things that I remember I think it was Catherine actually, when you came in from local government, said the difference with civil service from local government is civil service is much less good at defining the space that civil servants, an individual civil servant has to take decisions. And the good organisations, mark out your ground. Say, this is what you're expected to deliver. These are the outcomes or outputs we're expecting from you. And actually, that's the space within which you can operate. But you're responsible for doing it. And that's both a liberating and empowering thing. I remember when I was a very young minister in the Thatcher government, I had a difficult European issue I was dealing with. And it was one where we could have kind of gone to war or kind of ducked and dived and done a deal. And I wrote what I thought was a very elegant minute to the Prime Minister setting out the two options and what do you want me to do? And there came back a very terse letter from her, note from her private secretary. It simply said, the Prime Minister has read your note with great interest and agrees that it's a very difficult issue. i.e. you're on your own. Which actually was, slightly scary, but actually fantastically empowering. Because actually, you're a minister, get on and do it. And actually setting out the space within which people have the scope to make decisions and are then expected to take responsibility for it, that's a strong organisation. And actually we're not good at that in the civil service. And that's one of the things that needs to change.
Gentleman there.
Greg Rosen, thanks, Francis, for your very powerful remarks. One issue which has been raised powerfully as a problem within the civil service by the capability reviews, and which we have not yet touched this evening, is the problem of expertise and knowledge within the civil service being undermined by the rate of churn. And we talked about truth under power. Part of that is honesty, but part of that is accuracy vested in the knowledge of actually what you're doing. The reason for the churn is with the horizontal grades, you cannot promote people in post. If people are good and want to get promoted, they have to actually move sideways. I just wondered what consideration you'd given to how best to solve this important problem, which, as you've said before, is not new. It's often been revealed, and many have said it needs to be solved, but no one succeeded as yet.
Yeah. No, it's not easy. And actually, it's not easy in lots of organisations. People often complain about churn among ministers, but actually rotation among civil servants, it has been as big a problem, and everyone agrees that it's... One of the problems is that there grew up a sort of sense that, there should be a kind of open market within the civil service. Where a vacancy crops up, you're kind of entitled to apply for it, and if you get it, good luck, you leave your job. And actually, I think we need to be moved towards, and this is part of the talent management program that I talked about. In the old days, people's careers used to be more proactively managed. And so you weren't just able to push off and do a new job because you fancied it. And you were told, you stay there and do that. And, and the big companies do the same thing. The leadership cadre, if you like, have their careers very proactively managed. And the Foreign Office is still quite good at this. But the rest of Whitehall has become much more laissez-faire. And that has to change. But a bit about the sort of specialist knowledge thing. And it was a thing that only occurred to me fairly recently. Is when we were doing the work leading up to the publication of the plan, and the permanent secretary said, when we were talking about capabilities, and that permanent secretary said, well, of course, the age of the generalist has gone. And I kind of thought, well, I didn't think about it really, which is daft. Everything should be. And it kind of felt like, yeah, that sounds like the right thing to say. We live in a world of increasing specialism. But actually, you do need generalists. And actually, what is the specialism that a generalist civil servant has? It's analysis, clear-headed, objective analysis, the ability to look at a problem, analyze it, come up with solutions. But then the self-knowledge to know what you don't know. And because we constantly say there aren't any generalists anymore, one of the malign effects of that is that it's much more difficult for people to say, I don't know how to do that. And so they struggle on kind of thinking, oh, I can't admit that I don't know how to do that because I'm not meant to be a generalist. Well, actually, that's wrong. I mean, one of the hugely important things in any organisation is having the confidence to say, I know I'm pretty good at quite a lot of things, but I don't know how to do that. So I'm going to say I don't know, and we'll find someone who does. And I think that's a real kind of cultural problem that we have in the civil service. So, you know, you need both. You need civil servants who spent a long time in one place, knowing, and who really have deep knowledge. And when you find that in parts of Whitehall, it's incredibly impressive. Really clever people who are totally immersed in something, and it's huge. But you need the generalists as well. You need the blend. And actually, any company will tell you the same thing. You need that blend.
One last question, lady at the front.
Hi there, my name's Winnie. I'm from Civil Service World. We met yesterday.
Indeed. What are you doing tomorrow?
What are you doing tomorrow? I was wondering, we've seen a lot of things in the press about how the civil service needs a reform. We've seen a lot of things from yourself about the very deep problems within the senior civil service. How big a danger is there? Or don't you think that there is a massive danger that by giving the civil service and the senior civil service generally such a public, harsh bashing, it will increase and deepen the rift between ministers and civil servants, which will make it harder to work with and possibly make it harder to create good policies, which then, at the end of the day, will really lead to the taxpayers suffering?
Well, I don't go on about how terrible it is, but you know, we do need, if things aren't working well enough, we need to say so and be honest about it. And too often in the past, there's been a sort of easy, lazy view. We have this ancient, well-established system, and it's the envy of the world. And it isn't particularly, actually. There are lots of places where, and there's nowhere that is particularly. I mean, there aren't any perfect civil services anywhere. They all struggle with a lot of the same problems and the same challenges. And actually, we learn a lot from each other. So I don't think sort of trying to pretend everything's fine and sort of saying everything is lovely is a way of engendering the sort of bonding, if you like, that you want. I mean, what you want, what actually bonds people and builds trust is discussion. I mean, honest discussion, openness, and which is why I say that the thing that's most annoying when it happens is when the people who are advising you don't advise you not to do something, but then don't do it. That's really corrosive of trust. Very open discussion, that builds trust, that builds confidence. And actually, you know, it's when it works well, it's fantastic.
Thank you. Before asking Right Honourable Margaret Hodge MP to deliver a vote of thanks, I just want to say one small thing, which is that I think this is a unique and unprecedented event. For the first time, a guest of honour has had a glass of red wine on stage, which I think has been a very, very happy precedent in the light of the great candour of Francis's remarks, which we will ensure that people continue to get their top-up. So whoever's idea it was, thank you. And thank you, of course, in this context, to whoever on the team who played so noteworthy and excellent a part in organising this event, to Harriet Mackenzie, to Jen Katsaros, to Lynn Middleton, and to Sarah Fink. Thank you for all your help in organising tonight's event. remembering Leonard Steenberg's important thing to do. We're very proud to be able to do it in the Apple Pie organisation tonight, and the record turnout is a tribute to those whom we're commemorating, and also to the potency and importance of the message that you have tonight. Francis, Margaret, thank you for coming. You're always welcome on our platform. We look forward to hearing what you have to say.
I was going to start with an offer to Francis. He complained that he has no security of tenure, and Bernard, Jenkins and I both were elected by our peers. We have 5 years security of tenure, and it's better than I ever had as a minister under the Blair-Brown government. So I invite you into opposition. More seriously, I think thanks to the Steinberg family very much for facilitating that. And all thanks to you, Francis, for, I thought, what was a refreshingly open and radical, if incremental, contribution to the debate. And I think if anybody has demonstrated, you have the drive and the energy and the leadership, words that you chose to use, to ensure that we actually make progress on civil service reform. I think because of the transitional nature of politics, it's really important that if we are going to move the tanker forward and try and shift its direction a little bit, that there has to be a unity of purpose and agreement across the political parties. So I very much welcome your invitation to me to join you tonight. And I have this sort of observation that actually every day that passes from after a general election in the life of a political administration means a slight shift of power from ministers to the civil service. So if we don't grasp the agenda across parties, we will actually find that there will be a resistance, I'm afraid, in my view, to change. I share entirely your agenda. I don't think there was anything which you spoke about with which I disagree, whether it's about the professionalism and talent, whether it's about accountability, whether it's about having a faster, flatter, better motivated civil service, whether it's about tackling the bias towards inertia, the failure to implement decisions, the desire for candid advice, and a more unified system. I think all of that is hugely important. And I also share with you that this thought that everything works best if it is done in partnership with civil service. And your whole contribution tonight was littered with an understanding and an appreciation of really the high quality of civil servants that we do have. In fact, government needs the civil service even to enact radical civil service reform. But I think I'd make a few other observations. I think there are shared frustration between the bureaucrats and between civil servants. Civil servants have to sometimes justify the most crass political decisions, often policy not designed with any thought to implementation by some ministers. I think there's an onus on ministers there to make sure they do the job properly. And ministers also are frustrated. I had to share with you the classic email I had on one occasion when I had to talk to Charlie Faulkner about some shared responsibilities, and I got my speaking note from officials which said, and I'll read this to you because I've kept it, I've drafted up a one-page what to say and what not to say. If there are any awkward direct questions, it's entirely open to Margaret to just say, that's a matter for you, Lord Faulkner. In fact, she might be wise to do so. Sympathetic nods, interesting, and I see a good too. So I was well and truly told what was expected of me as a minister. And that really encapsulated for me the frustrations. I think we've got to continue to work on the resistance to change. I can possibly be slightly more blunt than Francis and say that I'm not sure that reform is a universally shared objective. It's not what people say, it's what they do on which we have to judge them. I think there is still a resistance to transparency, and I think that is hugely important. You've done enormous work in this regard, and we're grateful for it in Parliament. But if we look at things like the Major Projects Authority and the difficulty we had in getting out their analysis of where we were on major projects, and then it came out at 4 o'clock on a Friday afternoon, there is some reluctance still to be totally open in the way that really would build accountability and I think better government. I think I might be slightly more revolutionary than you are, Francis, in that I do think we have to look at the constitutional settlement of civil servants being accountable to ministers who are then accountable to Parliament. I think we have a very complex civil servants at present, and we have, from our point of view as parliamentarians, I think it's something that Bernard will probably share. We want to be able to actually not have civil servants, simply speaking, saying things because they feel their minister wants to, or ministers having to defend silly civil service decisions. And so I think rethinking that, seeing if we can do a better divide between policy and between implementation, although it may mean more public disagreements between civil servants and ministers, which might actually lead to better government. I think it's something we should think about and be more open about. And I think if ministerial accountability is real, ministers must have the power to hire and fire. I think otherwise we build the relationship on a lie, and we ought to be open and straight about that. But if there are more appointments by ministers, I think that has implications, again, for transparency in the way those appointments are made and the accountability of the people who are appointed to Parliament. And the final thing I suppose I'm bound to talk about is you've talked about the relationship between government and the civil service. I'd add in the third partner, which is Parliament, and I think we have to think about how government, whether it's the ministers or whether it's the civil servants, are accountable to Parliament. And Bernard Jenkins does a huge amount of work, very, very effective work in taking this forward. But we have challenges here, and from my point of view in the Public Accounts Committee, we are determined to follow the taxpayer's pound. And in the new world that has been created by the reform agenda, with greater fragmentation, more localism, more private sector delivering public services, it's very important that we think through, in that context, how you get accountability, not just of the civil service cohort, not just of ministers, but of this wider group of people who spend the taxpayer's pound. And my very final thought is, I couldn't agree with you more, because we're sometimes accused of being against this. Innovation is key to reform. Risk is absolutely vital. But if risk is taken, it has to be properly thought through, not taken on the hoof. And I agree entirely that hands up, and I don't think, Bernard, you and I in Parliament would be critical at all if actually there was an honest and open discourse around risk, and also if there were occasions when things went wrong. I remember very much when we brought in the scheme to try and get individual learning accounts, which was a risky proposition which went badly wrong. We did get lambasted for that, I think wrongly. I think it was a risk worth taking. But I would welcome innovation from this government at this very, very difficult time with tight public finances to get better value for money from the and better services for the public. So thank you for your very stimulating contribution to the debate tonight. Thank you to Policy Exchange for occasionally hosting me as well. And I warmly welcome the continuing, not just debate, but the enactment of some of these really important ideas. Thank you.
Let me speak a truth. The evening is over. Thank you for coming.